I'm Jim Harrington.
And I'm Trisha Taylor. And this is the story of the Leader's Journey podcast. This is really fun because today is our 100th podcast. We have a little bit of an anniversary and a celebration. 100 episodes, if you can believe that. We have had enough to say to fill 135, 40-minute podcast, which is kind of hilarious to me. Since when Tim first brought it up to us, my first thought was, I'm not sure the world needs another podcast. So what on earth are we going to talk about? And it has turned out that we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that has kept it going is that we're both learners. And so it's not like there's a set, a fixed set of data that we thought we'd come to the podcast and share that data. But there's been this unfolding journey that we've been on of learning how to lead in a fast-paced, ever-changing world. And the podcast kind of reflects that.
That's true, because we will make a schedule and then we'll get jazzed about something or want to talk about something, or one of us will come in and say, this is really cool. We need to do a podcast about this. And the schedule is always changing. So I mentioned Tim a minute ago, and I want to give a shout out to our producer and friend and team member, Tim McGee. We'll put some of his info in the show notes, but he was the one that said, y'all really need to do this. And I think you were pretty up for it, maybe. I know I was terrified. I would get so anxious when we would go to his studio. It would just ruin my whole day because I was so scared. And then, by now we just do it, and it's not even something that creates anxiety anymore. So, Tim, you were right and I was wrong. But Tim said, for the 100th episode, why don't y'all tell the story? Tell the story of the Leader's Journey. Tell the story of the podcast. We tell a lot of our stories, as we're talking about other things. But, and I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. So I want to start by just saying just a couple of statistics. As of today, we've had more than 133,000 unique downloads of our podcast. So it's just a lot of fun to think about how it just goes out there and takes on a life
and what that
of its
reminds
own.
me of is that's amazing to me. And I remember when we started when we launched the Leader's Journey, for a month before we launched it, I laid awake at night for several hours wondering if anybody would even want me to be their coach. And so the fact that there are people actually listening to what we're doing is amazing to me.
I think I managed my anxiety by saying that we were just going to keep doing what we'd always done, just with a logo. It helped me just kind of not get too worked up about what might happen. But, even just this week, you don't know this, I'll tell you this. I went and looked just this week. We've had more than 100 listeners in Europe, and 7 in India, 7 in Pakistan, 66 in Australia, which is kind of fun, 3 in Cambodia, and 1 in Namibia. And I want to just say hi to our listeners in Cambodia, Namibia, and all those other places. It's just fun to think about who we get to talk to and how often we hear from y'all, how often we hear from our listeners saying, hey, this meant something to me, or I learned something, or this is how I put that into practice. And it always makes us smile when that happens.
For sure. I had no idea that we had people. I mean, I coach a guy in Slovakia, and I know that he listens to the podcast. So, but I'm amazed that there are so many countries where people are listening. Very encouraging.
Yeah, that's just fun. So that's kind of the beginning of the podcast. But before the podcast, which started, by the way, in April of 2018, April 6th, I think, 2018. Before that, we started the Leader's Journey. And my first memory is you calling me and me standing at my office over on the 4th floor of my building, looking out the window, and you saying, so would you like to start a company, start an organization? to take this work that we're doing together forward in a different way. And I remember just kind of thinking, sure, I want to keep working with you. I want to keep doing this work. So, yeah, we'll figure out the
Yeah, I have
details
a very
later,
different.
but let's do it. Do you remember
Yeah,
that phone
well,
call?
my memory is that we were at the Cynical, and we were doing this series of meetings where we were inviting pastors to come out to the Cynical for a day of
Mm-hmm.
solitude and do some presentation on our part. And we did our presentation, and then they all went to solitude, and you and I went for a walk. And what I remember is that I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
that may be before or after this call you're talking about. But what I remember is you saying, "Oh, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I'll have to talk to Craig." Like it seemed to me like you were a little nervous or resistant about the possibility of you and I launching out into something new. But that may or may not be true.
That's perfect that we remember it differently, since we do everything differently and always have. That's pretty perfect. No, I do remember the feeling, particularly, what am I going to do with my counseling practice, was a big piece of that for me. How do I do both things? Do I wind something down? And it's worked out great, but I do remember feeling like, I don't know. Yeah. And were you as enthusiastic at that time as you seemed to me?
Yeah, I was. I was
Yeah.
pretty enthusiastic about doing it. I had some anxiety about whether it could be successful, but yeah, I am kind of a serial entrepreneur in some ways. I am like to start things. I'm not as good at staying with them over the long haul as I am coming up with new ideas, getting people excited about those ideas, and finding ways to get started. I'm not afraid to say, I don't know how to do this. Let's just go figure this out. Let's make this up as we go along. So that was, and part of what I remember, Trisha, is that all of that startup happened in a season where you and I and Steve Capper in particular had worked together in the faith walking ministry. And there was a season where funding for faith walking decreased, and we could no longer pay you and Steve. And you know what I remember about that? I look back and feel really embarrassed and feel like it was a moment where we say regularly that anxiety makes you stupid. Well, I had a moment where I got stupid. The two particular board members who I had this is the highest regard for came and said to me, "We cannot keep doing this." In any not-for-profit ministry, you're forever raising money and trying to figure out where the money's going to come from. And I think that they just got tired of that, and they said, "This is what we have to do." And rather than saying, "Well, what we've done in the past is we've all gotten together and talked, and we've taken pay cuts, or we've figured out other ways to do that." And instead, what I did was I just said, "Okay." And I look back, and I recognize that that was very painful for you and Steve. That it was unexpected. You'd been making plans to move in a certain direction. We were making plans to do that together, and you've been remarkable about that. Like you could have said, "Harrington, you can't count on him. You can't depend on him. Let a little pressure kick in, and he'll get stupid, and that'll have impact on me." But instead, what you did was you stayed the course. We continued to find ways to work together, and it was several months later. I don't know how much time there was between that and the start of the leader's journey, but there were several months where we continued to do retreats together, and we continued to be friends. And you were very gracious and generous in all of that moment. And I don't feel any shame today. When I look back, if I were telling the story of places where my anxiety made me stupid and it was had a lot of impact, that would be one of the 2 or 3 stories that I would tell in my personal life.
I never even thought about connecting the end of that work with the beginning of this work. But that is part of our story that we had. By the time we started doing this, we had been in some kind of working relationship for 20 years. We met in 1997 and had written a couple of books by then and done some big projects together in addition to that work.
What you just said is one of my early memories. I think if I were reflecting on how this has happened and what the important markers were, I think in the early stages, we had worked together a good deal, but not at the level of connection that this required us to. We were in business together. We were partners. We'd written a couple of books together. We'd done some things. This just took it to a new level of intensity. And I mean, you know this story, but what I remember is where this learning comes into focus for me is that we got invited by the Reformed Church in America to speak at a conference in Chicago, and there were 300 or 400 people in the audience, and we had several presentations, and we were just both being who we are, doing what we do, and and then on the plane home, one of the infamous airplane conversations that we had. You had the courage to say to me, "You really embarrassed me in front of people today." And I was shocked that I embarrassed you because I would never do that on purpose.
Right. And I knew that.
I recognize that your personality is not to do that kind of confrontation. And so I recognize that it was taking a lot of courage for you to say that. And there are two things that I recognize. One is that's kind of a vignette of you and I learning how to maximize our differences. And it's required both of us to continue living into our strengths, but also making adjustments to do the work, to collaborate in a more effective way. And that season, I mean, that moment was a moment in time, but that season was a season where more and more, I think I was just in a conversation the other day where somebody said, "Do you have any experience with two people who are really opposite in a ministry working together?" Well, only what I do all day, every day. That's for me. That's one of the big memories of the work and of what I've learned about how my assertive, direct, sometimes aggressive style impacts other people, and learning how to take into consideration that communicating differently in a different style has impact on people. All of that has been huge learning for me in this process.
And we really tried to share that learning along the way. You know, our listeners have heard some of those stories, and also I think know that there were dozens of stories for everyone that we tell. You know, for every airplane conversation, there was a coffee shop conversation. But, I think it's safe to say now that it's worked. And when I think about why it's worked, part of what you just said is one of those reasons. We have a long history of showing up in trustworthy ways with each other. And one of the ways you have shown up trustworthy for me is from the very beginning, insisting that, although you in the beginning were the name, that we were paid equally, and have always done that. And in our, in the leader's journey, in this expression of it, everything we've done has been equal. We have shared everything equally, and neither of us has veto power over the other. But the memory that I have that happened years ago was when I finally said to you at a Cafe Express, actually, I remember I said, and we've had at least 2 or 3 of these pivotal conversations at Cafe Express. I said, I have been acting like a junior partner, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And you said, great. Your response was, I guess maybe I had a little bit of trepidation that it might feel like I was, elbowing my way into your territory. And your response was, good, come on. And from that time on, really tried to act against my anxiety makes me stupid default, which was to just kind of, not show up fully. So I think that's why it's worked. I think it's worked because our friendship really is genuine.
And
what else would you say about why it's worked?
Because one of our core values is the value of authenticity. I think part of what's made it work is that you have taken some really huge steps forward in terms of your own courage, where you have given me feedback about how I show up, about what the impact of how I communicate is. I still say this, even when you give me feedback today, I get defensive. I think I think that
A little
shows up
bit.
less in the space between us. Uh, but pretty quickly, what I say to myself is this defensive feeling is a feeling that's saying to you, pay attention. This is really important feedback that you need to take in.
Yeah.
And because we value that authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
what you said about yourself over and over is that you have been an accommodator. You figured out how to get along and go along with particularly the men in your life, and just with every passing day, and even still, your courage to say to me what needs to be said, and I think my willingness and ability to hear it. That we work with some
Mm-hmm.
clients who get feedback
Yeah.
from who are the quote the bosses, and they get feedback from people on their team, but they either don't listen or they discount it or they find a workaround. But I really do think that I listen, and I think you've been really courageous in giving that feedback to me.
Yeah, for sure. And that has just been an ongoing learning process. I also think it's worked because we have had some amazing support, right?
Yep.
I mean, our
Yep.
spouses, first of all, Craig on my
Yep.
end, Betty on yours, they have been
Yeah.
incredibly supportive. Craig and I were talking just last night about this podcast, and he said, well, I think the thing that I'm just most present to is how much you love this work. And he's always known that and supported that. I'm really grateful to
Yeah.
him. I know
Yeah.
you
I
feel the
mean, I
same
think
way
Betty
about
is just
Betty.
one of the remarkable people on the planet. And people who know me, where I, doing work in places across North America, feel like they know her because I say that so regularly in our, I tell stories about her.
Yeah.
Uh, but we've also had, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Tim McGee and people like that on our
Mm-hmm.
team,
Mm-hmm.
um, Mike DeRuyter
Yeah.
and Andrea Baker and Ryan Donovan. I mean, we can make a list of
Right.
all those people who have encouraged and supported
Right.
and
Well,
challenged and uh, yeah, all of that.
mm-hmm. Yeah, let's do. I mean, Ryan and
Yep.
Marika were the first, and Marika's no longer working with our team, but, remains a dear friend. And then Andrea and Mike and Mac and Victor and Dawn and Alyssa. And now brand new, we'll introduce these folks, but we
Yep.
have Deborah and Nate. And so, yeah, this team is just fantastic. And then I also remember, we did kind of a soft launch of the leader's journey and a little bit of a spotlight on our second book. And so many of
Mhm.
our people
Yeah.
showed up for that and encouraged us. And others have thrown business our way and invited us to join them in some of their work. And that's just been phenomenal to see this support and never competition. That's just shocked me that the people that that we um, are friends with who do similar work or or at least sometimes veer into the same lane as us, it's all support and never competition, and I
Well, and
love
then the
that.
clients that we've gotten to work with, both at the national level with the Reformed Church in America
Yeah,
and with Vineyard USA,
yeah,
it was people in those organizations when they had a need that said, "Oh, we know Jim and Trisha. We read their book. They've done coaching or teaching for us," and so the confidence that they expressed in us, the congregations that we're working with, the businesses that we worked with,
yeah.
are working with, the individual people that we coach. I mean, all of those folks. Uh, they didn't draw our name out of a hat. They knew us. They had been
Right.
connected to us, and the confidence that they expressed in us was really encouraging.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that. We've
Yeah.
had some obstacles or just the challenges that we've described, just relationally, our differences and so forth. But we've also had some other kinds of challenges from the outside. Not too long after we really got going with this work, the
Mhm.
pandemic started. And I know we both thought, well, now what happens? I mean, we were traveling. I
Yeah, a
was
lot.
traveling twice a
Yeah.
month at least. And you were traveling at least that much, probably more. And kind of thought, what does it look like to do this work in the middle of a pandemic? And one of the things I remember just being incredibly grateful for is I already knew how to use Zoom. So while I saw so many people struggling to learn this online way of doing work, we had already pretty much mastered that. And people stayed with us, and we learned how to do this virtually.
And now we're traveling a lot less.
I'm not sure I knew that would work.
I was
and it
really
does.
doubtful that it would work over the long haul. I mean, I knew during the pandemic we didn't have any choice, but I think I thought when the pandemic was over, we'd go back, and we do a little bit of traveling now, but we still have learned how to make the online stuff work, and we get feedback from our clients that it works, and that's been a huge learning thing. Part of what that triggers in my thinking is it was during the pandemic, so it all mixes together: the political upheaval in the country, the pandemic, the George Floyd's death. I think one of the big learnings for me has been, it's both come from working with you, a woman with a very different leadership style than I have, and then interacting with just a whole variety of people like John and Evelyn Ogletree and Johnny Gentry and Ricky Bradshaw, and people who are people of color who are in leadership that we've known for a long, long time. I wouldn't say that this was new learning, but I think that that the idea of unconscious bias has become much more prevalent in my thinking. I've worked with Mission Houston before I came to the Faith Walking work, and Mission Houston was all about unity in the body of Christ. And so I have lots of friends from people from all over the world who live here in Houston, and they have been my teachers and my patient instructors to help me see ways that bias shows up. You have done that with me, where you've helped me by your authenticity to see how my behavior impacts you. I can look back and see that I feel like as a white guy, I knew more about bias than many of the white guys that I knew. And I can look back and see how much I still didn't know, that has been an ongoing learning process that has been in some large measure fueled by our commitment to authenticity. The fact that we've got relationships with a whole wide variety of people. I remember being on a podcast with, not with you, but John and Evelyn Ogletree have a podcast. And they invited me to be on it one Sunday afternoon. And I remember getting off the podcast and saying, wow, I just learned so much that I didn't know, that was not in my awareness. So that's been a big part of the journey for me as well.
For me, that kind of dovetails with talking about the podcast itself, because I'm really proud of the series that we did on race. A friend had said to me, just as an offhand comment, as we were talking about some of the things that were happening in the culture, said, none of this gets better until white people start talking about it. And we did a series. I'm really proud of that series. And there's some others that we did that reflect not what we knew, but what we were learning. We did a series on trauma that I'm real proud of. We did some very intentional work during the pandemic, the early days, March and April. We came back, I think, about a year later to talk about more learning related to, not just the pandemic, but all the things that were happening and all the stressors that we saw leaders facing. And I've gone back and listened to some of those, and I'm really pleased with what we put out there then. I think it stands the test of time. And I look at those with a lot of pride.
One other that I would add to that is the 3-part series that we did with several different people on power dynamics. That also was a really good learning experience for me. I had, I had enough experience and information to know about that, but interviewing, people talking about their experience of that really was a powerful learning experience for me that just accelerated the ongoing learning that I'm trying to do about bias and how that shows up in the world, and how The privilege that I have as a white guy who's educated, middle class, all those things that would define me. Um, that that series was also very, very helpful to me. I'll never forget, one of the big learnings for me was in a course that I was leading for another denominational tradition. They asked me to lead a course on change leadership. And there was this woman, she was an attorney, she was a person of color. And it was about the time we were doing the power dynamic series where she very carefully and gently asked the question, I wonder if you've ever looked at your change theory through the filter of power dynamics. And she said, I can see how what you've been saying here today would work if it was a group of white people. But she said, if I was in a group, this whole thing is built on an assumption of authenticity. And based on my life experience, I have to be around for a while before I can decide whether it's safe to be authentic. And so all of that has been really powerful learning stuff for me that I really appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things that I think makes this work is that, you are just a voracious learner. There's never a time you're not learning. I think that's one reason maybe that you're not as into small talk is that there's no learning going on during small talk and you want to get right to the good stuff. And,
intimidating.
I'm always reading something that you've told me that you're reading and, trying to keep up. But the idea that our work really does come out of our learning that's fresh. Some of the scaffolding might be in our book, which came out, a few years ago, but the learning is always fresh. And so when I think about that phrase, how it starts is how it goes, I would say in that sense, that's really been true.
Another thing that I wanted to be sure and mention today has been the evolving learning that we've done around how to lead and how to do congregational consultations. And all of what we've just been talking about impacts all that. But as we work with the RCA, with the Ritter Church Renewal, what now called Churches Learning Change, I would commend to every congregation that I know. We ought to be sure and put that in the show notes. But today we've come to describe something that's evolved and emerged for us over time. Part of what I love about working together like we do, you and I and the team, is that regularly you'll say, well, Jim is the first one who said this. And I'm thinking, no, you're the first one who said this. And we can't really remember because it just emerges in the learning. But somewhere along the way, we started talking about leadership is 2 feet walking. And so on the one hand, there is this personal development side where I have to grow my capacity to be fully who I am, to be my best self, to bring that to both the easy conversations and the ones that are really hard. And then there's this work that is about mobilizing people around a shared vision. And those aren't two separate things. They're a symbiotic relationship where I've got to grow my capacity to be my true self. And as I do, that's going to impact how I lead the organization. As I lead the organization, that's going to challenge me to have to grow some more of that. And I have 100 memories of just places along the way where something got said. We were with Chad DeYager and the church in Chicago that he pastors, and we were leading a Sunday afternoon training event for his leadership team. And I heard you say, so often strategic planning is built in making decisions. A small group of people discerns, and then they go to the congregation and say, "Now y'all decide." And you said, I think what I heard you say was, if we don't move all of the process, not just the people who are at the center, but as you move out to the congregation, if more and more of that is not in a discerning way, which means it's slower, people get to resist, they get to ask their questions, they get to express their doubts, all of that stuff. That's just one little vignette of a dozen that I could mention where along the way, we've been trying to ask the question, how do you help people grow up, and how do you help organizations become more effective, and how do those intersect with one another? And I think I know a ton more 5 years later than I did when we started, in large measure because of who we are and how we do this work, and the fact that we're both learners.
Yeah. And that idea of 2 feet walking, I can say you were absolutely the one that brought those two things together. And the thing I remember is kind of like when you first did it, thinking, well, yeah, I mean, yes, that's exactly how it works. And before you described it the way you did, it seemed like, 15 different things. And then when you put it out there like that, I saw, oh, it's really just two. And everything felt a lot more manageable. And then, yes, that
Yeah.
accelerated the learning
Well,
so
and I think
much.
one of the other pieces that we keep in focus all the time is that the pace of change is so incredibly fast and increasing. And that impacts what you do and how
Yeah.
you do it. And so on each of those 2 feet walking on each foot, where used to leadership development meant having a weekend retreat with your elders where you gave them a copy of the policy manual and the list of people that they were going to be caring for. And now there's 10 or 12 skill sets that they need to develop that you can't do in a weekend retreat. You can't even do in a year. You've got to have a 3 or 4 or 5 year leadership development process. And in many places, because seminaries haven't trained pastors to do that, pastors aren't trained to do that. When you begin to say that to people, they say, "Oh, that makes so much sense," and it begins to shape how they think about leadership development in their own congregation or their own business.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that works for us. And this may be presumptuous, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. I think our clients know that we understand the pace of change that they grapple with every day and just the sheer impossibility of what there has to do at this pace that our culture is moving and all the tensions that they're expected to hold together and all the fatigue that they're experiencing while they're trying to do that while also having their own families and their own lives. And I think our clients know that we get that part of their lives and that we take that into account and that we see them with a lot of affection. I mean, that we genuinely care deeply.
Yeah. And I think and this may reflect both our personalities and our beliefs. I think that they recognize that we work to hold tension. But on the one hand, there is a lot of empathy and affection and compassion for what they're going through. And there is a challenge that that has to be faced. It would be really nice if we could all go off to a retreat center somewhere and say, for a couple of years, I'm just going to take it easy and get caught up. But Sunday's coming and the work that has to be done. And so how do you balance the safety and the challenge or the love and concern and care with so now what are you going to do? Where are you going to get into action? And I think we do that well. If I could be so presumptuous to say that.
I think so too. So I want to end with just one question and just ask you, what have you enjoyed the most about this podcast, the leader's journey that it reflects? What have you enjoyed the most?
The thing that comes up for me is the collaboration. The collaboration that you and I have done, the collaboration that we do with our clients, the collaboration we do with other leaders. One of the fun things that we've done in the past couple of years, is we've developed a writers group with Todd Bolsinger and Mandy Smith and Fulu and Chuck DeGroat and Steve Cuss and Robert Creech. We've developed a learning community where we spend a half a day together. And just the collaboration that comes from that. And like, I don't know if this is the same thing, but in the collaboration, the deep sense of connection that comes to such a wide variety of really interesting, smart people who are making a difference in the world that I'm getting the opportunity to learn from. I want to say that I think perhaps the most profound thing that I've learned has been how learning takes place. I grew up in a world where learning was about passing the test, getting the information. I grew up in a discipleship world where discipleship was knowing the Bible, knowing the systematic theology, giving the right answers. When we started the Faith Walking community, we began back then saying most of our discipleship processes don't honor the way that adults learn. I will say to my clients on a regular basis, they'll say, boy, I've been doing this and I can see that I need to move in this direction. And I'll kind of joke and say, wouldn't it be nice if you could just say, okay, I'll stop doing this and I'll start doing this, and everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the labor of changing behavior that requires both some mental mapping where I learn to see my old self or my false self or that less than my best self, and I can see where it got stuck, and then naming with a kind of vision for a future that I could be living into, and then having some people that I can give my word to. I was in a conversation with I almost fired a client the other day. Uh, we had met several times, and he's got some really big stuff that he's working on, and has been very courageous to put all that out there. And then he canceled 3 meetings with me, and he missed a meeting. And I said to him, "Look, I love you, and I want to do this work, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do this, but you can't get the results that you want if we're talking every 6 or 8 or 10 weeks. The accountability that comes from knowing that you're going to have these conversations, from uh, just the difficulty of learning, and then when you add to that the fast pace of change, it just that has been, if not one of the most important things that then shapes how I think about how I interact with the clients, and what kind of things I say to them about what it's going to take for them to get from where they are to where they want to be. And often they're very frustrated with how slow that is. We live in a world of quick fixes, but yeah, that's been a really powerful part of the learning for me. Learning about learning. What about you?
I mean, you just expressed perfectly. I didn't use the word collaboration. I had just said the people, the opportunity that we have to get to know the most amazing people and to get to work with them and be in their lives. And, you know, you mentioned the work that we do with each other, which I just value more than I can even express, but also with our team, our clients. I love that when we travel, we're almost never going somewhere that we don't know
Right.
and love people.
We hardly ever go one up.
that everything, everything we do is embedded in relationships and people that are doing really, really amazing stuff. Some of it that's known publicly, some of it that's not, but get to see leaders leading really well and people doing really fun stuff, and we get to be in their lives. And in this podcast, when we record, I think what helped me get out of my anxiety about it was I really do picture all those people, some I know, some I don't, that are listening. And I'm just so incredibly grateful that people give us their time and that they listen to what we have to say. And it thrills me when we hear back from them and they enter into the conversation with us. And so I think as we end this conversation, I just want to name the gratitude that I have for that.
So as we draw this to a conclusion, I think I speak for both of us. You already expressed this in some ways, but I think we're deeply grateful for each other. I think we're deeply grateful to our listeners. We're deeply grateful to the clients where the learning for them and for us takes place and then becomes a gift back to the rest of the world. We're grateful for the feedback that we get from you, for the ways that you interact with us, and we would love it as we start the journey toward the podcast number 200. We was asking you if you would subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and what would really be helpful if you'd leave us a review. That would we consider that a real gift. So thank you for allowing us to tell the story today, and we're really grateful.
Yeah, thanks so much. Take care. We'll see you next time.